Every presidency leaves a physical imprint on American cities, whether visible or not. In this series, we'll trace how federal planning decisions made under different presidents continue to shape urban life long after the headlines fade. How presidents shape cities. American cities don't change overnight. They change one decision at a time, through housing policy, transportation funding, and who gets to shape growth. That means presidents matter. From Franklin Roosevelt's housing programs to Eisenhower's highways, to Johnson's civil rights enforcement, to Reagan's market-driven shift, to Clinton's public-private partnerships, and even Biden's reinvestment in infrastructure. Each administration left a mark on how cities work, sometimes expanding opportunity, sometimes creating new challenges. Donald Trump is part of that story. In this episode, we're breaking down how Trump's first and second terms reshaped federal involvement in urban planning and what those choices mean for American cities in the long run. When we talk about urban planning in the United States, we usually think local. City councils, planning departments, zoning boards, but the federal government plays a much bigger role than most people realize. Presidential decisions shape how housing gets funded, what infrastructure gets built, how environmental rules are enforced, and which communities are protected or displaced. Donald Trump's presidency across 2 terms had real impacts on urban planning, not always through flashy new programs, but through deregulation, federal retreat, and a shift in how government sees its role. Today, we're looking at how Donald Trump's presidency changed urban planning in the US and why those changes will shape cities for decades. Who really controls urban planning? Urban planning isn't just shaped by policy, it's shaped by philosophy. Trump's administration emphasized 3 ideas: less regulation, more local control, and a smaller federal role. In planning terms, this aligns with market-oriented planning and public choice theory. The idea is simple: local governments and private markets know best. The federal government should just take a step back. In practice, that means less federal guidance. Programs that supported regional coordination were reduced or eliminated. Federal agencies like the Department of Housing and Urban Development, also known as HUD, and the Environmental Protection Agency, known as the EPA, lost staff and enforcement power. One of the biggest changes was the rollback of the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule, often referred to as AFFH. To understand why AFFH matters, we need a little history lesson. The idea behind Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing goes back to the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Passed in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement, the law made housing discrimination illegal, but it also included an important requirement. The federal government and any city receiving housing funds was required to affirmatively further fair housing. In other words, not just avoid discrimination, but actively undo the effects of segregation. For decades, that requirement existed mostly on paper. Cities certified compliance, but there was little guidance, limited enforcement, and few consequences. That changed in 2015 under President Barack Obama. HUD Secretary Julian Castro led an effort to give AFFH real structure. The new rule required cities to analyze segregation, access to opportunity, and barriers to fair housing, and then sets goals to address them. It didn't mandate specific zoning changes, but it did tie federal housing dollars to data, planning, and accountability. In plain terms, AFFH means cities receiving federal funding must take active steps to reduce segregation and expand housing choice. That made AFFH one of the strongest tools the federal government had to influence local land use decisions, in the name of equity. Under Donald Trump, that approach changed. HUD Secretary Ben Carson played a central role in suspending and later repealing the 2015 AFFH rule. Carson argued that the policy represented federal overreach into local zoning. The administration reframed AFFH as a threat to suburban autonomy, rather than a civil rights obligation. For planners, this marked a major shift, a move away from federal pressure for equity, and back towards local discretion with all the inequalities that come with it. There was also an unusual development during Trump's second term that affected federal planning agencies like HUD. Tech CEO Elon Musk, the Tesla and SpaceX guy, was brought in to lead a new initiative called the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE. The goal of DOGE was to reduce federal spending and streamline agency operations. As a part of that effort, DOGE reviewed budgets and internal programs at agencies including HUD. Now, it's important to be clear here, this wasn't a zoning policy or a land use rule. It was an administrative and budget-focused effort. But for urban planners, the concern was indirect. Cuts to staff and capacity at HUD can limit the federal government's ability to guide housing policy and support local planning, even without changing the law itself. In other words, planning power doesn't disappear all at once. Sometimes it fades through reduced capacity and fewer federal tools. Planning scholars like Edward Soja and David Harvey remind us that inequality is regional, not local. When the federal government steps back, those regional problems become much harder to solve. Housing, suburbs, and federal retreat. Housing was one of the most visible issues during Trump's presidency. In the first term, the Fair Housing Rule was repealed, enforcement weakened. In the second term, HUD proposed stricter eligibility rules for federal housing assistance. This included work requirements and new limits that could reduce access for low-income households. But what didn't happen is just as important. There was no major federal push to reform exclusionary zoning, no strong incentives for missing middle housing, no serious effort to link transit funding to housing production. Planning theory helps explain why. William Fischel's home voter theory shows how homeowners use zoning to protect property values. Tie-bout sorting explains how people self-select into places that match those preferences. Without federal pressure, those patterns continue. The result is uneven growth. High-capacity cities move forward, lower-capacity cities fall behind. Trump-era housing policy largely reinforced the status quo. Highways, transit, and federal priorities. Infrastructure is one of the clearest ways the federal government influences urban planning. Roads, bridges, transit, and airports don't just move people, they shape where people live, where businesses locate, and even who has access to opportunities. Infrastructure is where federal planning power is usually strongest. But under Trump, priorities shifted. The focus was on traditional infrastructure, highways, road expansion, freight movement. Public transit received less attention. Environmental review rules were also changed. The National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, timelines were shortened. Cumulative impacts were limited. Supporters said this sped things up. Critics warned it reduced community input and environmental protections. Planning scholars like Peter Calthorpe and Donald Shoup have long warned that car-centric planning encourages sprawl. For planners, the takeaway was clear: more reliance on local funding, less federal leverage, more uneven outcomes. Climate planning without federal leadership. Climate change has become one of the central challenges for urban planning in the United States. Flooding, wildfires, extreme heat, and stronger storms are reshaping where people live and how cities plan for the future. At the federal level, one of the most important agencies in this space is FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. While FEMA is often associated with disaster response, its role in urban planning goes much further. FEMA funds risk mapping, hazard mitigation, and long-term planning designed to reduce damage before disasters occur. During Trump's second term, that role shifted. The administration proposed and implemented limits on FEMA's budget growth and staffing capacity, with a particular emphasis on constraining long-term mitigation spending. Fiscally, this mattered because mitigation funding is one of the few federal tools that help cities invest ahead of time in flood control, fire prevention, and climate adaptation. When those resources are reduced or harder to access, cities are left to shoulder more of the cost themselves. For larger, wealthier cities, that can just mean delays. For smaller or less resource communities, it can mean no project at all. Socially, the impacts are uneven. Lower income communities and historically marginalized areas are often more exposed to environmental risk and more dependent on federal planning support. When that support is limited, these communities are more likely to experience repeated damage, slower recovery, or permanent displacement. For planners, this creates a familiar challenge. Local governments are still expected to plan for climate risk, but with less federal capacity to guide, fund, and coordinate that work. In effect, resilience planning doesn't disappear. It becomes more fragmented, more local, and more unequal. In planning theory, this shift is often explained through resilience planning. Resilience focuses not just on surviving disasters, but on a community's ability to adapt, recover, and reduce future risk. Earlier ecological planners like Ian McHarg argued that cities must plan with natural systems, not simply rebuild after they fail. When federal agencies like FEMA lose planning and mitigation capacity, resilience becomes uneven. Wealthier cities can invest ahead of time, lower income communities often cannot. From a planning perspective, this turns climate risk from a shared national challenge into a local test of resources. And over time, that reshapes who can remain in place, who is forced to relocate, and which cities are able to recover at all. That dynamic, reduced federal capacity combined with rising climate risk, is a key part of Trump's planning legacy and a critical setup for the long-term implications still unfolding today. What this means for the future of cities. Presidencies end. Planning systems don't. First, the federal planning state is weaker. Judith Inez and John Forster remind us that planning depends on stable institutions and expertise. Second, deregulation becomes the default logic. When planners talk about deregulation, they're not talking about the absence of planning. They're talking about a shift in how governments intervene. Deregulation means reducing or removing federal rules, oversight, or requirements and allowing markets or lower levels of government to play a larger role. In urban planning, this often shows up not as fewer plans, but as fewer federal standards guiding housing, transportation, and environmental decisions. Over time, that changes who has power in shaping cities and who does not. It's also important to separate deregulation from decentralization. Decentralization spreads decision-making, while deregulation often shifts power from public institutions to private markets. In planning theory, this is commonly described as neoliberal urbanism, a framework associated with scholars like David Harvey, where market logic increasingly replaces public coordination in shaping cities. Growth machine theory from Harvey Malich shows how speed and land value often override equity. Third, spatial inequality deepens. Susan Feinstein's Just City framework argues planning must correct injustice, not simply manage growth. Fourth, cities become policy leaders. This reflects collaborative and insurgent planning theories, innovative but uneven. Finally, the planning profession itself changes. Paul Davidoff's advocacy planning reminds us planners are never neutral. Why this still matters. Trump's presidency didn't just change policies, it changed the structure of planning. Federal leadership pulled back, local responsibility expanded, inequality between places widened. Cities adapted, planners innovated, but collective solutions became harder. Understanding this matters, because cities don't just reflect politics, they remember it. They don't just happen, they're planned. Thanks for watching Understanding Urbanism. I'm Jasmine, and in future episodes, we'll take a closer look at how past presidents have shaped American urban planning and how those decisions are still visible in cities today. Hit subscribe and see you next time.